All right. Well, let's get back to our lecture on the family, where we are talking about sociology of the family and how family functions as a social institution, whether public or private. We talked about that before. And also, we're looking at the ways in which various social identities work in terms of complicating and disrupting the idea of the family, right? So in this lecture, we are going to look at some of the intersections. We talked about intersectionality and what that means. And so now we're going to look at some of the intersections of family, particularly when you talk about, we've had these kind of bigger conversations about family. So now we're talking about particularly race, gender, and sexuality when it comes to the family. And in specific micro ways, how when you consider all of these social identities, some of the ways in which families are presented and treated in the United States are problematized. Okay, so before we get to that, what I would like for you to do, especially, I think it's extremely pertinent, particularly during this time in this month. I think this would be very interesting to go ahead and go to the next slide where it says negotiating sexual identity. And I want you to click on that link and I want you to watch these stories, right? These are stories of people who have come out. And I want you to listen and see some of the similarities and some of the differences in these stories of these young people who have come out. And then we'll talk about it. Okay. All right. So looking back, right? Couple questions. How was it different when men came out versus when women came out? How was it different? Interestingly enough, we might think that men coming out to their parents would be worse, or coming out to someone may be worse than women, because many people believe that sexual fluidity is more accepted among women than men, because even heterosexual women have this very kind of sensual, maybe even passionate way of dealing with other women, even if they are not attracted to other women, right? Women are just said to be more emotional anyway. So the idea of women, being sexually fluid appears to be more accepting. But when we look at this video and maybe even some of the data, what we end up finding is that women, it actually is very difficult for women to come out. And in this particular video, it's actually more difficult for the women to come out than it was for the men. And they received less acceptance than the men in the video when they came out. Now, who were involved in these conversations? Right? Conversations involve mothers and fathers, some with siblings, like they kind of came out to the sibling, and that was a little bit more accepted than when they came out to like their mother or maybe their father specifically. But what we ended up finding was that the mothers, particularly the one relationship that the young lady had with her mother, that was the one that was the most strained. Literally went her entire life, mother, without even really knowing that her mother maybe at the last minute accepted her identity, but went their entire life with this strained relationship. Right? And this is something that a lot of women, particularly women who come out to their parents, deal with. The next question, how does race play a role? All of these people were what? If not all, most of them, if not all of them, were of Latinx descent, right? They were all Latinx descent, which plays a role in the coming out process. Some people think, again, when you're not looking at something from an intersectional lens, you think, oh, well, when we talk about coming out, well, everybody's coming out process. If you're, LGBTQ plus, yes, it's going to be different from every individual, but we all have the same problems. Well, no, not necessarily. Race plays a role. And people of a certain race, it may be a little bit more difficult than people of another race to come out, particularly when it comes to race and maybe even religion. Well, definitely when it comes to religion, but race plays a role in religion. Certain people of certain racial groups are likely to lean towards certain religions. And that can then determine how difficult it might be to come out. Also, race plays a role in the importance of the family. The family structure and the cohesiveness of the family is very important among minority groups because of the levels of oppression that exist within society. We're going to talk about all of that in a second. And so because of that, race plays a role in sexual identity and being able to negotiate sexual identity. So what strategies, so before we get into that, this piece was written by a professor, Katie Acosta, and she's a sociology professor, and she wrote this book about women and how they negotiated their sexual identity, particularly Latino women, right? And the purpose of Dr. Acosta's work is to explore the ways Latinas who don't conform to heteronormative ideas of sexuality, how they have to deal with the tension in their families. And she looks at these complex relationships and finds that race plays a role, but also economics plays a role. And so Dr. Acosta exhibits the ways in which sexuality, which when added to the dialogue, shows that women from minority groups are presented with these added pressures. And sometimes they can suffer from internalized depression, right? These women in her study explain the various things they have to deal with when talking to their family about them being sexually nonconforming. And that's the term that we use as a kind of catch-all term when we're talking about people who fall into this category, because everybody is not lesbian, or everybody's not bisexual, or, you know what I mean? There's such a spectrum of sexuality that we kind of use sexually nonconforming as this catch-all phrase to talk about anyone who is non-heteronormative. So what strategies do first and second generation Latinas use when negotiating sexual nonconformity with their families? And so one category of negotiating their sexual identity with their family members is what she calls erasure of nonconformity. And what this means is that when the respondent tries to explain her sexuality to her family, the family members try to erase it. They try to erase it by using control tactics, by using manipulation tactics, okay? They use it by, sometimes using fear as a way of control, love as a way of control, fear or love as a way of manipulation. And there's this one example in the reading where the mother tells the daughter comes out to the mother, and the mother tells the daughter, you better keep this from your father, because if you tell your father, then he will kill himself. And that is a form of manipulation, because she's using fear that her father might die and the love that her father has for her and the love she has for her father to control and manipulate the idea that this should not come out. This secret of your sexual identity should not come out. And so Dr. Acosta calls this erasure of nonconformity, right? So we're gonna erase the idea that you are a sexually nonconforming person by, number one, controlling or manipulating the how much this gets out. Another form of control is the fact that race, again, is a factor. The reading also talks about a Colombian woman who was the only one out of her siblings to be successful in school, right? And so because of issues related to race and education, oftentimes we find that there are these achievement gaps between minority groups, racial minority groups, and racial majority groups, right? We find that there are these achievement gaps. And so because of that, oftentimes in a family of multiple people, you may have that one child that becomes successful in education, right? Or becomes successful in a way that is seen to be more traditional. And that one child then becomes the golden goose, right? Becomes the example. And because of the racial disparities within education, all of the family are saying, that's the child, that's the one that's going to be successful. That's the one that we want to represent the family in business or in politics or in society. And we're proud of that particular person. But because of that, this Colombian woman could not come out because she felt pressure to be the perfect daughter, and she began to hate herself. And she began to hate her gay self and she began to hate her feelings, and she suffered from what we talk about, internalized depression. We talked about internalized depression. Sometimes people call it self-hatred, but it's not self-hatred. It's kind of a psychological term, but it's really the impression that you've already been taught by society. Now you internalize it, you believe it, and then you spread that oppression among your own people. It's not because you hate yourself, it's because this is the hate that you were taught and forced to adopt, right? Gives it a much more communal description and understanding. Self-hatred just says you hate yourself. Internalized oppression says, no, this hatred came from somewhere. This hatred has a source and you're not the source, right? So that's part of erasure of nonconformity. Sexual silencing is the second category that Dr. Acosta talks about. And she says, when respondents choose not to disclose their sexuality with their family members, and when they are complicit with the ideas that all women relationships in their lives are strictly platonic, this is sexual silencing. What she found with a lot of her respondents in this study is that when they would come out, the family members would just pretend. Like, you know what? You just don't know what you're talking about. You just have really close women friends. They're strictly platonic, but you think you love them. You think you're sexually attracted to them. You're not. You just, y'all are just friends. Y'all are just friends. It's fine. And so there is this silencing. So the parents don't pressure the women to be with men, and the respondents say that all women in their lives are just friends. And there is this silencing that occurs when everybody pretends that everybody's okay. So it's kind of like the parents know, the children know, but nobody's saying anything. We're just going to be silent. We're just going to pretend like this woman that you've been inviting to dinner every week is just your friend. And it's been 10, 15 years. You've never brought a boy to the family. But you always bring this friend. And we're just going to pretend y'all are just platonic. And this is probably happened. You probably could be many examples of this, right? And then you have avoidance after disclosure. So then that's the last category, where the respondent has disclosed a sexual nonconformity, with the family member, but then everybody agrees to reject the reality of the situation. So they cannot bring their women friends home. So it's kind of like sexual silencing, but they're saying, you know what? We don't even want to see it. Don't bring no women over here. We reject the idea. You are queer or whatever, but not in the sight of the family. You keep that over there. When you come here, all we want to see is you. We love you, and we don't want to see any of your private business. Okay. And this can actually result in isolation. This can result in an alienation of LGBTQ plus members when they feel as though their family loves them, but doesn't love them fully for who they are because they can't be their full selves. This was even an example for a young lady in the reading who was in an abusive relationship, but she couldn't go to her mother because her mother didn't want to know anything about her relationship. Eventually, she was able to talk to her mother, and her mother was able to give her some advice, but she was in an abusive relationship with her same-sex partner. And she may not have had to endure the pain for that long had they not had this avoidance after disclosure category plaguing them in this coming out process, right? So these are the three main categories of negotiating sexual identity among sexually non-conforming Latina women. And a key part of, going to the next slide, a key part of this negotiation is the concept of La Familia. La Familia is very important. And this is where race comes in. La Familia or familiism is the concept that emphasizes loyalty, solidarity, and interdependence with family. And it is very important for Mexican populations and vital to their survival as immigrants in the United States. Family is absolutely important in Latinx societies. A lot of minority groups, but specifically Latinx societies, family is important. Now, this isn't to say that family is important to, white communities either. Obviously, family is important to a lot of people. But there is a racial reason as to why specifically it's important to Latinx groups. And the reason why is because Latinx people oftentimes have to deal with issues related to immigration, issues related to racism. And in order for them to be successful, and in order for them to a lot of times survive, not being deported, not being put in jail, not being detained or being placed in detention centers, oftentimes they have to stick together. They can't depend on society. They can't depend on other members of society. So they have to be able to depend on their family. Family is everything. Without my family, I don't have anything. Family is literal survival. With white people, family is important, but if they get cut off from their family, there is an entire system that can support white people. And there's actually a book. I don't know if we read it in this class, but there's a book called Pray the Gay Away. This deals with sexual identity and religion. I oftentimes teach out of that book as well. Usually in my 12-week sociology course, I do like a day or two where we just talk about Pray the Gay Away. It's a really good book, and it'll bring tears to your eyes. Some of the things these young people deal with. But one of the things that they talk about, or there was one actually, this young man, he was a white guy, and he was ostracized from his Christian family, but he had a whole system at his college that supported him and that helped him as he was marginalized from his family and he was transitioning into living out. But oftentimes minority groups don't have that. Specifically, if you're a minority group that is said to be undocumented. So you don't have society because society already trying to push you out. Or even if they accept you, you're already seen as a rapist, a criminal, lazy, all these different things. So the only person you have, the only people you have are your family. So La Familia is everything. So family is important to a lot of people, but family is a means of survival for Latinx communities, specifically Latinx communities that are undocumented. And so under familialism and La Familia, there are these important descriptions. One is that if you are a part of the family, you must support the family in their time of need, period. Family comes first, family over everything. Next, the family must be physically and emotionally close when possible. If you can, you live around your family. If you can, you be around your family. If you can't be there physically, emotionally, you're listening to them, you're talking to them, you're emotionally connected. You never disrespect the family. You're never disloyal to the family. You preserve the family name. That means if you're out and you're representing the family and your name is whatever it is, you represent the family well. If you're a man, you marry a good woman that's going to hold up the family name. If you're a woman, you hold your family name until you get married to another man. You take his family's name and you uphold that family name. You preserve the family name. Now, notice I said if you're a man, you preserve that name. If you're a woman, you're responsible for two names, your name and your husband's name. So if you're talking about being a lesbian, how you gonna preserve the family name? I can't have the name connected to a lesbian. How are you going to preserve family tradition by marrying or being with another woman? So that goes against La Familia. That's why these types of situations are even more a threat and even more I don't want to say heinous. I think heinous is a big word, but deleterious to Latina families, Latinx families, because of the idea of La Familia and how important family is to the person and the individual and the community and the race, and how being sexually nonconforming disrupts that. And then lastly, you got to respect the family rules. You have to respect the family rules. If mom says do this, dad says do this, you respect it, no questions asked. That means if you're expected to grow up, pass high school, go to college, get a good education, get married, have some kids, you need to do that. Going against that would be going against the family. And so the core value for other Latino groups is La Familia as well, right? And La Familia is not just supportive financially or emotionally, but La Familia can be manipulative and controlling because some family members will use it as a way of, trying to control the family unit. Just like how the mother did to the young lady when she said, if you tell your father, he's going to kill us. She's using La Familia against her and using the love that she has for her family and the respect that she has for her family against her. Right? And so Du Bois did an assessment of the Black community with Souls of Black Folk, and we talked about that. Acosta does the same thing with women in this and sees that loyalty to family is very important, again, because of their migrant status, the socioeconomic needs, experiences with racism, but also in La Familia, the mother is extremely important in the concept of La Familia. The reason why, and this is how we get to the title of the article, How Could You Do This to Me? Because the mother is the one who is responsible for enforcing sexual morals and heterosexuality in the family. The father is responsible for going out, working, making a home, bringing food, making sure everybody has what they need. The mother is responsible for enforcing morale, making sure these kids go to school, making sure these kids are learning and they're educated, making sure that they are being raised in a certain religious idea or spiritual idea, making sure that they're emotionally healthy, making sure that they're making right decisions. You instill morals and values in them. And part of those morals and values is not being gay or not being lesbian. So the mothers consider it a direct affront to their position as Latina mothers, to their position in their family and in their community, their role as women. It is a direct affront to them when the daughter specifically comes to her and says, Mom, I'm a lesbian. She's like, you basically just told me everything I did was wrong. You told me that everything I was taught traditionally as a mother, I did wrong. How could you do this to me? It's not real. It's about you being lesbian, but it's about you basically telling me I didn't do my job. And now I got to look your father in the eye when he comes home. And although he's going to accept you because you're his daughter, he's going to look at me and say, why didn't you do your job? Why you didn't teach this girl that she's supposed to like men? Why didn't you teach her that she's supposed to be sexually moral and do things in the way that God wants it? That's how he's going to come to me. And so that's why this article says, how could you do this to me? Because it is showing that strong relationship between gender and sexuality and the complications and the problem and the way in which and she problematizes the way in which gender and sexuality and family work together to make this very different from the coming out process for a white family or even the coming out process for a Black family. It's very different for a Latinx family. And particularly for the mothers, which again goes against the more common notion that it's more difficult for men. All right. So before we get into it, how do you think economics plays a role when we're talking about sexually non-conforming people? It's something to think about. Because class also plays a role, and they talk about it in the text. You remember? If not, we'll talk about it in a second. But going back, again, mothers are the major enforcers of sexual morality. And so they receive more of the resistance and the non-acceptance. That's why they say, how could you do this to me? I raised you better than that. So sexual non-conforming, again, is a reflection of the parenting, of the failure to teach normative sexuality. So La Familia made it so that these families were oftentimes not accepting of Latinas' same-sex relationships and or sexual orientations. Probably even until that, some of them never really accepted it. But La Familia would not allow the parents, the children, to rebuke these women entirely. So La Familia made it difficult, but La Familia also helped them maintain some level of a relationship so even the mothers, even the parents that were like, we don't believe in this is not right, saying it's not of God or whatever, right? Those same parents will still say, but you're my child. And I love you. And La Familia says, I have to accept you. I can't turn you away. You're my child. I may not be completely happy, but it's something I'm going to have to learn to deal with because you're my child. So La Familia is almost like this two-edged sword. Familial reactions caused a lot of guilt and led some of them to do in this invisible work to appease the relationship. So sometimes the children would do these other things, like, again, stay away from the family or just pretend that, you know what, just pretend I never said anything and we'll just keep living and we'll just keep holding these secrets. And sometimes people did that just because they wanted to have a good relationship with their family. Right? So again, La Familia complicates this coming out process for young women, especially young Latinas specifically. So going back to the economics question, what Katie Acosta ends up finding in her interviews and in her research study of sexually nonconforming Latinas who come out, what she ends up finding is that for Puerto Rican lesbian migrants, upper class professionals and economically disadvantaged women didn't have to depend on families. So this eased the tension of sexual disclosure. That's something to consider, right? If you are really rich, you got money, and your money is taking care of the family, and you come to the family and say, hey, I'm a lesbian, they might be like, huh? Oh, I can't believe this. This is, but then they got to remember, ooh, she paying our rent. She paying for the utilities. She's paying for this person's college. I don't want to make her too mad. It's okay. Invite your partner over. We'll make them some food and invite them to the family events. Right? And that makes sense. That's not surprising. But even the poor Puerto Ricans, even the ones that didn't have to depend on their family, not because they had money, but because they didn't have money, also found it easier. I'm not depending on you anyway. Because y'all poor, I'm poor, we all poor. I'm fending for myself anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And it was easier for them to disclose their sexuality. So social class plays a role, right? Women's social positions puts them at an economic disadvantage, though, because sexually nonconforming Latinas must find new ways to negotiate their identity because women are more likely to be at an economic disadvantage. See, it was people in the middle who had to depend on families. And so because most people are in the middle, working class, middle class, then they were more conflicted about their sexual disclosure and more vulnerable under the opinions of the family. And so what we see is when we add on aspects of race and gender and sexuality and class, Western notions of coming out does not apply to the Latinas in this study. And so we have to remember that intersectionality is important. A lot of times when we study just white people, or maybe even just Black people, we like to apply that to all people or all minorities. And it's like, well, that's not the case. You have to consider the intersections. You have to consider all these different experiences. And once we do, we realize Western notions of, well, this is the way to come out and this is how you come out to your family. But you can't just say that just because it worked for white people or just because it worked for one group. You have to consider race and gender and sexuality, class in every group. I know it takes a lot more work, but that's how we become more accurate in our assessments. And so the familial interaction strategies in which they engage foster feelings of failure, self-deprecation, and internalized homophobia. The non-acceptance made these women vulnerable and left them without the protective cover that La Familia would otherwise provide for them. Okay, so a lot of these women did have feelings of self-deprecation, internalized homophobia, hating their gay selves. And sometimes La Familia was helpful, but then sometimes they did not have the cover that they needed to navigate life, which is why many of them may not even come out at all or will just participate in these other forms of disclosure to keep that covering, because again, the family is necessary for Latinx survival in the United States. Okay. So what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to watch this video. You don't have to watch the whole thing. I think it's after about the first half of it, you kind of get the idea of it. So watch this video. It comes from one of my favorite shows, Glee. I love Glee. Glee is it's such an interesting show. I watched that. I watched the whole series over and over. And so after that, I want you to create a post answering the questions at the end of this slide. And I want you to use information from the lectures in your post. And in addition, I want you to respond to another student's post using information from the lecture to support or challenge these ideas. And I want you to engage in the discussion board post entitled, "How could you do this to me?" And, obviously the instructions are on the syllabus. You know how to do a discussion post. It's due by June 17th, 11:59. And I want you to respond to these questions. What themes from the reading are evident in the video that you see with this interaction? And how does this video help us understand the notion of La Familias? Okay, so I want you to answer these questions in detail. Use concepts, things that we've just talked about in this lecture, or even in the other lecture of family. Use these ideas and kind of let's engage in a larger discussion. So that being said, have a great day, great week, great weekend. Come see me during office hours if you need to, or send me an inbox message, an email. I usually check them during my office hours, but sometimes I'm able to check them outside my office hours. And look forward to hearing from you.